I've lived in my quiet little cul-de-sac for nearly 12 years, and until recently, my backyard and front garden were my pride and joy. Rows of tulips, hydrangeas, and a line of freshly planted lavender framed the front walkway like something out of a countryside magazine. I'd put in hours of work, day after day, tending to the soil, pruning, watering, and ensuring my little green patch stayed immaculate despite the dry summers. Most of my neighbors appreciated it, well, except for one person, Karen, the newly elected head of the HOA and self-proclaimed community standards enforcer. Karen had a voice that could cut glass and the patience of a matchstick in a bonfire. She drove a white SUV that seemed too big for her driveway and somehow always found its way onto my garden. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe she misjudged her turns. But when it happened for the third time in a single week, I realized it wasn't an accident. She was aiming for it. The first real confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when I was kneeling in the dirt, planting a row of petunias near the edge of my front lawn. Her SUV roared past at an unnecessary speed for a residential street, tires grinding onto the strip of soil I had just prepared. A puff of dirt and crushed petals flew into the air, landing on my shirt. I stood up, brushing myself off, and waved for her to stop. She did, but only to roll her window down halfway and smirk at me. "You really shouldn't plant things so close to the curb," she said in that syrupy, fake sweet tone. "It violates Section 14B of the HOA landscaping guidelines. Driveways and road access points must be kept clear." I blinked at her, my mind juggling between is she serious? And did she actually just quote a made-up rule? My property line was clear, the garden was within legal boundaries, and there was nothing in the bylaws about curb-adjacent planting. I told her as much. She just chuckled, put her SUV in gear, and said, "We'll see about that," before pulling away. I knew right then, this wasn't going to be a neighborly disagreement. This was war in the making. Over the next few weeks, Karen escalated. If she wasn't, accidentally, swerving onto my lawn, she was filing bogus HOA violation notices about my overgrown plants which were trimmed to perfection, my unapproved birdbath grandfathered in since 2011, and even my choice of mailbox color. I tried taking pictures as evidence, but she was careful. She'd only drive onto the garden when I wasn't looking, leaving tire marks in the soil as if daring me to call her out. My other neighbors sympathized but were too afraid to speak against her. Apparently, Karen had a reputation for targeting dissenters, higher HOA fees, sudden safety inspections, and endless bureaucracy until they either paid up or moved out. It was petty dictatorship at its finest, and I was directly in her crosshairs. Then came the morning that pushed me past my breaking point. I had just finished installing a small decorative fence, nothing tall, just a knee-high wooden border to keep the flowers safe, when I heard the now familiar rumble of her SUV. I looked up just in time to see her veer deliberately off the asphalt, crush the fence flat, and roll right over the center of my tulip bed. She didn't even slow down. My hands were shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. I stormed after her, but by the time I reached the street, she was already gone, leaving only shattered wood, mangled flowers, and 2 deep ruts in the soil as her calling card. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smirking through the window that first day. That was when I decided, enough was enough. If Karen wanted to play games, I was going to give her a game she couldn't win. I didn't come to my decision lightly. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys confrontation, but I also believe in defending what's yours. So, I started planning, not something reckless, not something illegal, but something that would make it physically impossible for her to drive over my garden again. I began researching soil reinforcement techniques, anti-animal deterrents, and yes, even medieval-style road defenses. That's when I stumbled upon a forum discussing garden security spikes. Normally, they were marketed for keeping stray dogs or cats out of planters, lightweight, rust-resistant, and barely visible once installed. But if placed at just the right angle and depth in freshly packed soil, they'd stop any vehicle from taking a casual joyride over my flower beds. I placed an order for a box, and then another. It wasn't going to be just a deterrent, it was going to be a lesson. The package arrived on a Friday afternoon, and I swear I had to keep myself from grinning like a cartoon villain as I opened it. Inside were 24 matte black strips, each lined with conical metal spikes about 3 inches tall, sharp enough to deter even the most determined raccoon, or in this case, an oversized HOA president with a superiority complex. They weren't dangerous enough to puncture a foot if you stepped carefully, but a heavy vehicle's tire. Oh, that was a different story. A spike might not explode the tire instantly, but it would certainly puncture and deflate it within minutes. I ran my hand over them, testing the weight. They were solid, discreet, and perfect for what I had in mind. That night, after most of the neighborhood lights had gone out, I got to work. The moon was a sliver, and the air carried that late spring chill that made every sound sharper. I laid out the strips just beneath the soil, camouflaging them under a thin layer of mulch and freshly raked dirt. The beauty of it was that from the road, my garden looked exactly the same, lush green edges, neat rows, nothing out of place. But lurking beneath was a silent line of defense waiting for an arrogant white SUV to wander into enemy territory. I placed the strips only along the outermost strip of the garden where her tires always passed. My hands moved with surgical precision. This was my moment of reclaiming control. When I finally stood back, wiping my hands, I felt that deep satisfaction you get when you know you've just ended a long-standing problem, or at least set it up to end itself. I didn't have to wait long. The very next morning, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee when I heard it, the distant growl of Karen's SUV. It was like clockwork. 8:07 a.m., she'd leave to get her overpriced oat milk latte from the cafe in town. Normally, she'd slow just enough to line up her wheel with my flowers, then ease over them like she was crushing something worthless underfoot. This time, I kept my eyes fixed on her approach, hiding my anticipation behind the coffee cup. She swerved right into my garden, right into the trap. The crunch was barely audible over her engine, but I saw her front passenger tire dip slightly before she pulled back onto the road. She didn't even glance my way, and for a moment, I thought maybe the spikes hadn't worked. 5 minutes later, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for, a loud, rhythmic thump echoing back down the street. Karen's SUV reappeared, crawling toward her driveway with a sagging front tire. She parked crookedly, got out, and stared at it with a mix of disbelief and outrage. From my porch, I took a long, slow sip of coffee, keeping my expression neutral. I could see her mouth moving, no doubt muttering a colorful range of insults, as she crouched down to inspect the damage. She didn't look over at me, but I knew this wasn't over. If I knew Karen, this was going to trigger an entirely new level of pettiness. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd scored a real win. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I saw her stomping toward my yard in her oversized sunglasses and wedge heels, holding what looked like a printed page in one hand. This, she announced loudly, waving it around, is an official HOA citation for property hazards. I raised an eyebrow. Hazards? I asked. She gestured wildly toward the garden. Whatever you've got buried in there just destroyed my tire. That's vandalism, and I will be taking this to the board. I fought the urge to smirk and instead leaned on my rake. Karen, if your tire was damaged, it's because you drove off the road and onto my property. Maybe if you stayed on the asphalt where you belong, you wouldn't have that problem. Her mouth fell open like I'd slapped her with a trout. This is a community space. She blurted, clearly reaching for any argument. No, Karen, I said slowly, savoring each word, this is my yard. And it's going to stay that way. That's when she leaned in, lowering her voice. You think you've won something here, but you haven't. The HOA can make your life miserable. She straightened, turned on her heel, and marched back to her driveway. I watched her go, my mind already racing. She'd just declared open war, and I was ready to fight it to the bitter end. The very next day, my mailbox was stuffed with not one, not two, but 6 separate HOA violation notices, all with the same smug signature, K. Whitmore, HOA President. The accusations ranged from improper landscaping height, to unauthorized garden fixtures, to my personal favorite, potentially dangerous ground modifications. She'd even included grainy, zoomed-in photos of my flowerbed taken from what was clearly her SUV window. It was almost impressive how quickly she'd weaponized HOA bureaucracy against me. I stood there on my front porch, flipping through the stack, and felt that little twist of irritation in my stomach. She was going to try to bury me in paperwork, fees, and rules she'd made up on the spot. But here's the thing, I'd done my homework. Before installing the spikes, I'd checked every single HOA landscaping clause twice. The spikes were classified as animal deterrents, and their placement was well within the property boundary, 3 feet from the curb, exactly as specified. And as for Dangerous modifications. Well, the bylaws were very clear. Only modifications above 6 inches in height required board approval. My spikes, hidden under mulch, were invisible to anyone who didn't deliberately dig for them. Legally speaking, Karen was swinging a foam bat and calling it a sword. Still, I knew she'd drag this out, so I gathered my own paperwork, time-stamped photos of my intact garden before her SUV attacks, copies of the bylaws, and even footage from the small security camera I'd hidden in a birdhouse by the walkway. That footage, by the way, included a very clear shot of her tires rolling over my flowers more than once. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Karen had turned the incident into neighborhood gossip. I could feel eyes on me as I walked into the community center, violation notices tucked under my arm like a deck of winning cards. Karen was already seated at the front table, flanked by 2 board members she'd roped into her little crusade. She opened the meeting with exaggerated professionalism, announcing serious safety concerns about my property and hinting that certain members were endangering the community with hostile landscaping. That phrase alone almost made me laugh out loud. She tried to pass a motion to force me to remove all unapproved ground alterations, but when the board asked her for evidence, she launched into a dramatic retelling of her tire incident, conveniently leaving out the part where she was trespassing on my lawn. That's when I slid the stack of photos and the birdhouse footage across the table. The room went quiet as the images cycled on the meeting's projector. Karen's SUV clearly swerving onto my property, the crushed flowers, and finally, her front tire rolling directly over the spike strip area. I didn't say a word until the last image froze on the screen. Then I leaned forward and said, "Everything on my property complies with HOA regulations. If there's damage to your vehicle, Karen, it's because you repeatedly drove off the road. That's not a community safety concern, that's reckless driving." A few muffled chuckles came from the back of the room. Karen's face turned the shade of an overripe tomato, but before she could spit out another argument, one of the board members cleared his throat. "From the evidence presented, it appears the spikes are within regulations, and the tire damage was self-inflicted." Motion denied. The gavel hit the table, and just like that, her first official attack had crumbled. After the meeting, I half expected her to confront me in the parking lot, but she simply stalked to her SUV and drove off, slowly, this time, sticking to the asphalt like it was lined with molten lava. Still, I knew this wasn't her giving up. No, Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The way she'd gripped her steering wheel told me she was already planning her next move. And I was right, because 3 days later, I got a knock on the door, and this time, it wasn't Karen standing there. It was a uniformed police officer, holding a clipboard. When I opened the door, the officer gave me a polite nod, the kind that says I'm here because I have to be, not because I want to be. His badge read Officer Reynolds, and he glanced down at the clipboard before speaking. "Sir, we received a complaint about a hazardous setup on your property that allegedly caused vehicle damage. Mind if I take a quick look?" I didn't have to guess who filed it. I could practically hear Karen's voice in the phrasing. Hazardous setup sounded exactly like something she'd used to make garden spikes sound like landmines. I stepped aside and gestured toward the yard. "Sure, officer, but you'll probably want to hear the whole story before you start writing a report." We walked to the edge of the garden, and Reynolds crouched down, brushing the mulch back just enough to see one of the spike strips. He tapped it lightly with his pen. "You installed these?" "Yes, sir," I said evenly. "They're anti-animal deterrents, perfectly legal, placed within my property line, and well within HOA regulations." I handed him a manila folder I'd prepared days ago, containing printouts of the bylaws, purchase receipts, and photos showing Karen's SUV veering off the road. "You'll see in the pictures that the damage to her vehicle came from her driving onto my property multiple times without permission. I also have timestamped video from my security camera." He flipped through the papers, pausing on the photo where her tire was mid-roll over my flowers. His brow furrowed in a way that told me he'd already decided how this was going to end. "Well," he said, standing up, "these are sold at hardware stores all over the county. They're not illegal, and from what I see here, the only person committing an offense was the one trespassing on your yard." He closed the folder and gave me a small smile. "I'll make a note in the file, but you've got nothing to worry about." Not 5 minutes later, as Reynolds was heading back to his cruiser, Karen herself came storming. Across the street, phone in hand. "Officer, are you seriously not arresting him? He vandalized my car." Reynolds didn't even break stride. Ma'am, you damaged your own car by leaving the roadway and trespassing. That's on you. If anything, he could press charges against you." The color drained from her face, but she recovered quickly, shifting gears into full indignation mode. "I'm the HOA president. You can't talk to me like." Reynolds cut her off with a dry, "Ma'am, that title doesn't mean anything under state law." Then he got in his car and drove off, leaving Karen standing there, sputtering like a kettle about to boil over. I thought that might be the end of it. Surely, after being shut down by the police and the HOA board, she'd realize she was outmatched. But I underestimated Karen's ability to double down on bad decisions. That very night, I saw her pacing in her driveway on the phone, her voice sharp and animated. The next morning, I woke up to find something unbelievable: a freshly printed flyer taped to every mailbox in the neighborhood, accusing me of creating dangerous booby traps, and calling for an emergency HOA meeting to vote on my removal from the community. Removal, as if she had the authority to evict me from my own home. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to defend my garden anymore. I was going to put an end to her little reign entirely, and I had just the plan to do it. The so-called emergency HOA meeting was set for Saturday afternoon in the community center, and by the time I walked in, the place was buzzing. Karen had clearly gone all in on her smear campaign. A huge printed banner reading, "Protect our streets from dangerous residents," hung behind the board table, and on the sign-in desk were stacks of her flyers, each with a photo of my garden cropped to make the spikes look like some kind of medieval bear trap. She was perched at the center of the table in a bright red blazer, radiating smug confidence, clearly expecting to bulldoze the room with her speech. When the meeting began, she launched into a dramatic presentation, pacing back and forth as she told the crowd how my hostile landscaping was a menace to community safety. She even tried to compare my spike strips to war crimes. Yes, she actually said that. The board sat stiffly, trying to look impartial, but I caught one member hiding a smirk. When it was my turn to speak, I walked up to the front with my laptop, connected it to the projector, and calmly began my counterattack. "Before you decide if my garden is a threat," I said, "let's look at the facts." I clicked to the first slide. Side-by-side photos of my garden before the spikes, rows of flowers, intact, vibrant, and after one of Karen's joyrides, crushed plants, muddy tire tracks. The next slide, footage from my birdhouse camera, crystal clear, time-stamped, showing Karen's SUV veering off the road and directly onto my property. I could hear the room murmuring. Then came the kicker, a zoomed-in shot of her front tire rolling over the exact area where the spikes were hidden, followed by the date-stamped police report stating that the spikes were legal and the damage was self-inflicted. I ended with a direct quote from Officer Reynolds: "The HOA president's title does not override property law." By the time I finished, the room was dead silent, except for the sound of Karen's nails tapping furiously against the table. One board member cleared his throat and said, "Given the evidence, it's clear there's been no violation. Furthermore, the HOA has no grounds to remove a resident in good standing from the community." Then, in what I can only describe as poetic justice, another board member added, "However, repeated trespassing is a violation of our community's code of conduct. Since we have clear proof of that, the board moves to fine Ms. Whitmore $500 for property damage." The gavel came down before she could even open her mouth. Karen's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She stood up so fast her chair tipped over. "This is ridiculous. You're all against me," she shouted, before storming out of the meeting. The door slammed behind her with enough force to make the banner wobble. A few neighbors actually clapped. The next week, her SUV stayed firmly on the asphalt. No swerves, no crushed flowers, no fake violations in my mailbox. She'd been publicly humiliated, fined, and shut down by both the HOA and the police. The spikes remained in place, not just as a deterrent, but as a silent reminder of the day she lost. My garden bloomed brighter than ever that summer, untouched and thriving. And every time I watered it, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that in our little suburban Cold War, I'd won without ever leaving my yard.